In the late fall of 2015, 6 young analysts of the NATO Association of Canada did a very thorough research of Canadian defence policy and prepared recommendations for the new government. The complete document can be accessed on our website, www.natoassociation.ca. I want to stress that there are young people who are interested in Canadian defence policy and who do stay on top of the latest defence and security issues. Their contributions can be accessed continually on our website. There are 3 key messages in their paper which I want to summarize today. They're not in priority order, and I can provide more detail on any of them. But the first message is that Canada is a trading nation. Canada produces far more goods and services than its population can consume, but its economy depends on markets for all its goods and services. Therefore, it depends on global security for its markets and secure routes to its markets. Therefore, it needs to work with its allies in NATO, NORAD, and the UN in an interoperable way to ensure that those markets remain accessible by enhancing global security and by ensuring that the routes to those markets remain accessible and safe. That may require Canada from time to time to go outside its borders to help ensure that other borders will be safe enough to ensure that Canadian companies can trade abroad. The second point is that given our extensive geography and sparse population, almost everything that Canada needs for its expeditionary forces is the same thing it needs to secure its own boundaries and respond to its own crises and surveillance requirements. We need search and rescue capabilities and transport capabilities into the high Arctic, and we need to be able to project power on our coastal boundaries in the Arctic and elsewhere. Our armed forces are our best resources to respond to any crises anywhere in our vast country. And finally, we need to understand that defense spending is not in opposition to spending in other areas. This is something that our young people feel very strongly about. It is not a zero-sum game. The Department of National Defense provides both direct and indirect jobs, and they are good jobs with extensive training programs that will prepare participants well for any job opportunities. The defense industry provides good jobs, and for example, the infrastructure requirements in the Arctic are equally beneficial to the military and the civilian requirements. A good deep-sea port and a good all-weather road will provide better access to goods and services and markets for both the military and the civilian population. They are shovel-ready, only waiting for the federal go-ahead. I think I would like to leave my remarks at this point, and I will be happy to elaborate on any of these points and answer questions.
I think it would be helpful for those watching in particular to understand how the NATO Association in Canada relates to the NATO associations in other NATO countries.
Thank you. I welcome the opportunity to clarify that. When the North Atlantic Treaty was first signed, it was agreed by the country signing it that NATO would not have to promote or advertise itself, but that it was the job of the respective governments of those countries to organize some way of informing their publics. So almost all the then members of NATO set up an organization like ours. Some were called the Atlantic Councils, the Atlantic Council of the US, the Atlantic Council of the UK, and originally our name was also the Atlantic Council of Canada. However, in confusion as people wonder why we're located in Toronto rather than Halifax, and whether we have anything to do with shipping and fishing. And so last year, when it was necessary for all non-governmental charitable organizations to get articles of continuance under the new legislation, we took the opportunity to change the name from Atlantic Council of Canada to NATO Association of Canada, and NATO gave us permission to use that name. Our role is to inform Canadians about defense and security issues, particularly as it relates to NATO activities and Canada's role in NATO. There is an umbrella organization based in Brussels called the Atlantic Treaty Association that we are all members of, and we meet once or twice a year, once as a general assembly and once as a council meeting where the heads of the various associations meet, and we are briefed by NATO and other experts on things that are going on.
And thank you.
Wondered if you could expand a little for me. You have some excellent recent publications, and if I'm reading one of them accurately, you're recommending an increase to 100,000 regular and 50,000 reservists to the current Canadian Armed Forces. And a lot of Canadians watch the National Security Committees at home. Would you be able to expand a little and tell me why you believe such an increase is necessary over our current amounts of about 27,000 and 66,000?
Yes, I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you.
One of the things that the analysts did was to look very carefully at the lessons learned from recent activities. And nobody in August of 2001 had any idea that the Canadian Armed Forces were going to be so heavily involved in activities in combat as they ended up becoming involved. And they were so undermanned at that point that many soldiers went on 2 or 3 rotations without very much time in between. And it was felt that some people have suggested that may have been one of the causes of increased post-traumatic stress and so on. And so that's one of the points that we wanted to look at, is to ensure that there be a well-equipped, well-trained force in the regular forces that are readily deployable for whatever is needed. As far as the reserves are concerned, it is much less expensive to train a reservist than it is a regular soldier, and yet the reservists were integrated extremely well into the forces that went to the Balkans, that went to Afghanistan, and really did do very well. And the other point is that they are a good, strong link with the community. The reserve units the people stay in their own community, they have their own jobs, but it creates a good link. And then finally, a point that was reiterated several times by our young analysts, who in fact are all looking for good jobs, is that those jobs in the military are good jobs. And when we talk about employment initiatives, they might just as well be part of, be in the military. There's excellent trades training, for example, in the military, and there's all the other things like the leadership training and so on. And so it was felt strongly at both the regular level and at the reserve level, increasing it to a really credible number that would allow Canada to respond when necessary to both domestic situations and international situations.
Thank you very much. That's excellent.
I would like you to elaborate on the changing terrorist threat within Canada and on how we could cooperate with our NATO allies in order to improve, or rather to reduce, the possibility of radicalization and the jihadist threat. Could you please give us your point of view on the kinds of improvements we could be making?
Thank you. Yes, that is a very pertinent question at the moment, this whole notion of radicalization and homegrown terrorism. I think it's very important for us to look at what some of the other countries are doing and what is successful and what is not successful. Apparently, there's a program in the UK that is being quite successfully implemented. I believe it's in Birmingham, but I may be wrong about the actual location, where they have looked at connecting more with the young people who are potential candidates for radicalization and involving them more. But it's definitely a matter of sharing information, and I think that has to be done internally. Our different security elements, police, RCMP, CSIS, they all have to work, I think, more closely together to share information, and then also on the international level to share with our allies to not only learn from them what is successful there, but also to be warned by them or to warn them. And I think that might go quite a ways to helping that. But I don't think there is a magic solution at the moment that would really solve the whole problem. But I think we can do things that will ameliorate the situation.
My question is for Ms. Lindhout. When we look at your report, you indicate that the government should increase the expenditures budget for the Army by a significant amount, by 2.5%. We need to increase the capacity of our Canadian forces and help them to achieve their objectives. Could you explain the importance of these increases and what they should be used for?
It should be used to increase the actual numbers of people in the armed forces. And there's going to be a lot of training required, and it's not only the Army, it's also the Navy and the Air Force, because they're all getting new equipment and they will have to be retrained. So that would be an important element. But given that Canada is such a large country with so many of its own internal needs, I think having more armed forces, for example, what happened a couple of years ago in the high Arctic when that accident occurred, the plane crash, it just so happened that the armed forces were there on exercises and were able to step in. But if we had larger numbers of them, we might be more able to assist in that way, and to be better equipped to deal with the situations that arise within Canada, situations to protect Canada's airspace. I think one important aspect that we often forget about with regard to the Arctic is that we need to be able to project power, not only if everybody immediately thinks of Russia, but that's not the only reason. If we want to be able to control what happens in the Arctic, which is rather fragile, we have to be able not only to enact regulations and legislation, but we have to be able to enforce them. And that, I think, will require more people power than Canada has at the moment.
You said that we should increase our personnel to simply cover not our obligations, but to protect our interests in the Arctic. How much should we increase our presence by?
Just to give a specific number, I think would be rather difficult, but almost any increase is better than what we do right now, because we have to be able to go to, I think, more places at the same time to back up our excellent ranger group there, but they're very sparsely spread out. And I think it's a matter of how quickly can Canada work towards increasing the numbers, and then to put them on regular rotations going through the Arctic. And that's equally important also for our the Navy and for the Air Force, because the distance, if anything happens in the Arctic, if we're trying to run everything out of Trenton, or that is a large distance, and I think it would be better capability. That's also one of the reasons why one of the recommendations is to ensure that there is a runway that is long and strong enough to be able to land the right kind of aircraft, and to have the ports, the deep sea port that will allow the ships to come. I think that's very important as well. And those are infrastructure things. So it's a matter of perhaps transferring some infrastructure money from elsewhere to D&D infrastructure building.
What is going to be your involvement in, for an example, the question that is becoming more and more important to Canadians and to the North America is the question of the replacement of the technology that's presently in the Arctic for the radar systems that are in place. And secondly, the question of the aerospace that was mentioned earlier in respect to a system of satellites that could be incorporated for the purposes of giving us communication, and also weather reporting, which most Canadians don't realize that we do not have a good system of weather reporting in the Arctic because of the polar location of the North Pole. I'm just would like to ask you also if you have any comments on the question of ballistic missile defense. And I know these are broad questions, but the point is that NATO and the Canadian government supports the installation of ballistic missile defense in the various countries in the that are adjoining Russia, and yet we are not part of the ballistic missile defense here in Canada. And we did do a study, a very thorough study here just a year and a half ago, in respect to how Canada should view this, and Canada should now be beginning to participate in that. So perhaps you have some comments in view of the fact that obviously your mandate has broadened, and how do you see your role commenting on these particular issues?
We are very fiercely nonpartisan in our activities and in our writing, but we do look very carefully at what might be helpful and beneficial, and to complete the defense circle, if you could call that, it would probably be very good. And certainly some of our NATO colleagues really believe that Canada should be participating in the ballistic missile defense shield, and keeping in mind that that is strictly defensive. But it would complete the shield up at the top of the country. NATO also regularly meets, even though it doesn't feel that it has an actual role in the Arctic as such, because there are other countries, not only NATO countries, bordering the Arctic. Nevertheless, it does meet fairly regularly to talk about issues that might arise if it is a defense problem, and it tries to keep the various countries talking together about those issues. And one of the things that you, Senator Lang, pointed out a couple of years ago was that there are people, real people, living up there in the Arctic. And it's very important for us to think of it not only as a vast space that needs to be protected, but also as a place where people live who need jobs, who need to feel safe, who need to be able to get products and get them to market. And one of the points that was made by Canada at the time was it's very, very difficult to talk in exact figures, but we generally speaking spend what we need to in order to meet our commitments to our partners. and that has been the historical point. But I certainly think that Canada, that the government needs to have a good look at what it needs to spend. And as I think I said earlier, maybe it needs to move some funds from some other areas into D&D to do the kinds of things that those funds were intended for. For example, infrastructure funding. The government has talked about additional infrastructure spending. Why not spend some of that planned money on D&D infrastructure?